I'm always a little torn. I told First Hour, when it comes time to do a talk like this about kind of the vision of our church, or when I'm sitting down across from somebody at a coffee table or whatever, and they're just like, okay, what's the vision for the church? And what are we doing this year? And I always want to start by saying, well, we're doing the same things we did last year, and the year before, and the year before that. That the things that God called us to several years ago are still the same things He's calling us to now. And just as when someone sets a sight on something way off and you keep working towards that, you don't veer back and forth. You keep working at the things that you're heading to. And so even though there's some new things we're going to talk about this year that are new, unique to this year, I want us to start by just re-hitting who we are as a church, because those things aren't going to change in spite of the things that we're going to talk about today. We have set out several years ago to help people follow Jesus. That's what we've clarified on. And in what I've realized is becoming who we are. It's a very non-hype sort of mission statement. It's not the big flowery paragraph that no one knows. It's very simple and clear, but it's what we're about. We're about reaching into people's lives inside this church and outside this church and helping them from wherever they are spiritually to follow after God, follow after Jesus. And I want us to be focused on that every bit as much this next year as we were this past year or the year before. We're an authentic church, and we've always set out to be that, to be real, to not have a lot of pretense, to not have a lot of hype, to not have a lot of fakeness between each other or from the stage. And I want us to continue that, to be real and authentic in how we approach each other. So if you're going through a struggle, you don't need to put on a game face for Sunday morning. If you're going through a hard time, you don't need to pretend you're not when you get to this room. You can be real and have people in your life that you can be open with. I was talking to a friend of mine this week, and they were saying how they were talking to someone outside of our church, and they were just having a conversation back and forth and just kind of being open and honest about who they were and the struggles they had. And this person said, you're like really a real person. You're just really honest. And they're like, well, okay. And they're like, what church do you go to? Because this is weird, this conversation we're having. And so they told him, and they said, well, is there other people at your church like that? I mean, is there other people at your church that's just honest about life? And we're like, yeah. And well, I'm going to check that church out. That's the kind of church. I mean, this is not what church means to me. I want to check that out. And we have always been, the thing I'm probably most proud of consistently for the last 8+ years is that we're a place that pretense doesn't happen so much. It happens some. We fake every now and then. It happens to the best of us. But by and large, this is a place where you can come in dressed as you are, the socioeconomic level that you are, the personality that you have, the struggles and weaknesses you have, and you can just be yourself. You don't need to put on airs that you're somebody that you're not. And you can come before God openly and honestly with people who are doing the same thing. I want us to be that way as much next year, every bit as much as we were this past year. We've always been a church that focuses on deep relationships. That you may be in a crowd here where you don't know everybody, but you know somebody, and somebody knows you, and you can love on them, and they can love on you. And when you go through struggles, they're there for you, and they help you out in real, tangible ways. And I want us to focus on that every bit as much next year as we do this last year. That if you're somebody who's able to give something to someone else, whether it's your time or your ear or your prayer or your hug, that you're open and honest to do that for those people in your life. And if you're somebody who has a need of time or an ear or a prayer or a hug, you're open enough to say that to somebody else around you. And if we're going to struggle, that's probably the second one more than the first, that you're open enough to say, I need somebody in my life. I want us to focus on that every bit as much next year as we do this past year. I want us to be a church that focuses on serving the community and meeting tangible needs every bit as much this next year as we did this last year and the year before that. I think about, again, the well that started out of this church and the vision some of you had, and then how we've gone into jetpacks, and those are just the start. I mean, those are just the start of what I hope we do as a church, feel called as a church over these next years. We'd love to, at some point down the road, open a counseling center where people could come and get help for emotions or marriages or kids, and money wouldn't be the big obstacle. They could get the help they need and may pay on a sliding scale. Same thing with a clinic. The people from every walk of life could come in and maybe they're struggling financially. You got single moms or whatever, and they could pay what they could afford and get the clinical needs met that they have. I'd love for us to start those things. The idea that if WellSpring somehow was zapped off the map and didn't exist anymore, it would affect more than just those of us who belong to this church. Spring Hill would grieve our leaving because there's a hole now where WellSpring used to be. And that's what we should be as a church. And I want us to focus on that every bit as much next year as we had this last. We need to be a church that focuses at least as much going forward as we have in the past on prayer. I mean, prayer has always been, if we can just be honest, this is one of those honest, open moments for the pastor to say this, but prayer has always been one of those things that we've talked about more than we've probably done. It's always been a high value for us in terms of going forward, and we've at different times prayed more or less than maybe what we should have, but we need to be focused on prayer. As we've been reading through these verses over the last several weeks, coming out of that sermon on the January 1st, where you're just trying to read through the Bible and the New Testament, I was reading through the book of Acts a couple weeks ago, and it just hit me how many times God shows up in dramatic, powerful ways, and they sort of just took it like it wasn't a big deal. Where if it happened in our day, it would be like, oh my gosh, what just happened? Like in those days, it happened so often, they just didn't make a big deal of it. In Acts chapter 5, the high priest came out and said, we're going to arrest some of these Christian leaders. They're causing a mess. And so the Sanhedrin got together and the high priest dictated, and they arrested Peter and others, and they put them in jail and they put them in stocks. And God in the middle of the night sent an angel and let Peter out, and the chains fell off, and Peter walked out. And the next morning they went in to get these people they had arrested, and they weren't there anymore. They said, I think that's them preaching over in the synagogue. And they went over and found them. They're just like a nonchalant, well, it's no big deal. Just the chains went off. And if you go forward several chapters into Acts chapter 12, King Herod, the political leader of that area, arrested Peter and some of the others, and he must have already heard the story from before, so he said, well, we're going to fix this. And so he had 4 groups of 4 soldiers keeping an eye on Peter, 16 men charged to keep him in stocks. And when the angel came in that night, there was one guy here chained to this arm, one guy here chained to this arm, one guy on the inside of the door, one guy on the outside of the door. He's not going anywhere. And Peter, I'd have been wailing to God, crying, sobbing, like, get me out. He was expecting execution the next day, I think. But Peter was sleeping sound. God's going to do what God's going to do. It's going to be fine. And so the angel comes in, wakes him up. The chains fall off. They walk past the guards. They walk out of the city. The gate opens up for them on their own. And the way the Bible writes that, the way Luke writes it in Acts, it's like it just wasn't a big deal. It's just what God does. We have got to be more focused on the power of God that's available to us through prayer. I think we downplay God so much in our day where we talk, well, he doesn't do those things anymore. He doesn't work powerfully anymore. But God so wants to take the chains that bind so many of us and let them free. The chains of oppression and addiction and struggle and anger and resentment. And he wants to let those free. And he wants to do big physical, tangible things that don't seem to make sense either. And we've got to be more focused on prayer than we have been before. We need to be focused in this coming year as much on reaching out to those far from God, every bit as much as we were before. We've always been a church that was focused on not just our people, but focused on the community and reaching them with the gospel of Christ. Helping people to follow Jesus has always been what we're about. And if we're not doing that, whatever we do great this coming year, if we do amazing, wonderful things, everything we set out to do, and yet we're not helping people to follow after God, we're not reaching out and seeing new people come to faith in Christ, then we've missed it. We've misunderstood what it is that we're called to do. Now, I want to give you some ideas about what's coming specifically this year, some new stuff that's on the horizon that I think is pretty exciting. But it dawned on me again after first hour that we're going to do this in a way that fits with who we are. We're not a hype church. We're not a church that's going to get a big emotional reaction. And so I don't want to present it to you in a way that tries to gin with your emotions. I just want to tell you what we feel like the leaders of the church feel like God is calling us to, and then I want you to chew on it and think about it and get involved in it if we can. There'll be a letter that goes out this week that'll give you a little more information. In fact, it's already in the mail. You'll get it probably Tuesday because of MLK. Tuesday or Wednesday, you'll get a letter in the mail that'll describe more of some of the stuff we're going to talk about. We are setting out as a church in this coming year to build a permanent facility for our church, to build a physical home for this church that God's been working on now for 8 years. One of the statements we've created that goes along with it, I'll put up on the screen, it says to build a self-sustaining building that serves the city, builds community, and advances our mission. I'm just going to ask that he keeps it up there for a minute because this is different than what typical church buildings are. And so I want to make sure we clarify some of the things that you may already understand or may have misconceptions on. What we're talking about is not just building a regular church building like churches often do, but something different than that. This building has been our home for the last 8 years. It's a community building 6 days a week, but on Sundays it becomes church. And because of that, we're able to do lots of things here that wouldn't necessarily fit into a steeple and white and stained glass and all of that. And in the same way, we're wanting to build a community building that also serves as a home for our church. So I just want to take those 4 points and kind of take them in reverse order, most important to least important. Most important is we're going to build a building that advances our mission. It got very clear for me a few years ago that whenever it comes time to build a building, the point of the building would not be to house our services. All that's important. We want to create a space that we could do church on Sundays. But the point of the building is not to advance our services. If we as a church, if the mission of our church is to help people follow Jesus, then the mission of this building is going to be to help people follow Jesus. And that's a very different picture than saying the mission of the church is to house our services. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's a very different picture. Everything that we do inside of that building, everything the way we design the building, everything the way we structure the building is got to be designed not just to house ourselves, but for us to fulfill our mission. Oftentimes when you talk to people who've gone through from being in portable facilities, new churches, into buildings, one of the downsides of that people talk about is everybody gets sort of self-centered and complacent and focused on internal needs. I think one of the reasons for that is you put all this time, all this energy, all this effort, all this money into building something for us. And if we put all this time and energy and effort and energy into building something for us, we've missed it, and we're going to change who we are. The point of this building is not to house our services. The point of this building is to help people to follow Jesus. And it's a much broader vision than that. So let's work in backwards order. One of the things we want this building to do, besides the things that our church is about, we want this building to build community in and around Spring Hill. One of the things that sociologists talk about a lot these days is the idea of third place. Some of you may have heard that. Architects are trying to pick up on that these days. But it's the idea that there's always been three places that people lived. They slept one place, their home. They worked one place. There's always a third place, a place that they would spend time together meeting with other people. So maybe it was the corner pub or the market down the street or the town square. There was always some place that people would spend and gather together to do community together. You see it in the New Testament when in Acts 17 when Paul goes to Mars Hill and they were all gathered there sharing ideas constantly, it said. It was the Starbucks of the first century, where they would go and spend time and share ideas and then do life together. Well, in our culture, and especially in Spring Hill, the third place is sort of non-existent. So most of you live in Spring Hill, you work in Brentwood or Franklin or Nashville, and the people you work with often live in Madison or Dixon or Mount Juliet. And so you don't spend time with them. So you have like this little isolated place where you go to sleep. And often we drive into our garages and shut the door behind us and go under our privacy fences. So you don't know anybody there. You go to work with people who don't live anywhere close to you. And there's no place then to build community on a larger scale. That's why people are willing to pay $5 for a cup of coffee, because it's about the experience. It's not about the coffee. And so we want to create a place that builds community. Along with that, we're going to put a coffee shop in the facility. We're trying to figure out the plans for that, but we want to put a coffee shop there, not just for our church. When we were talking to the city about some of the ideas we had to try to figure out zoning and all of that, we said we wanted to do this. And they're like, so you want a coffee shop for your members? We're like, well, yeah, it'd be great if they wanted to drink coffee there, but that's not what, we're bigger than that. They looked at us confused. And they said, so you want to build a place where your people in your church can bring their friends to drink coffee? We're like, well, yeah, that'd be great, but no, it's bigger than that. So you just want anybody to come into your building and drink coffee? You're like, yeah, that's kind of what we had. Really? They couldn't get a box. They were trying to figure out where to put us, and they couldn't figure that out. So we create a place that can have community building there, a large kind of seating area that has the coffee. We've talked about maybe the idea of having some sort of little sandwich shop off of that as well, like a deli, where people can come in and grab a bite to eat for lunch or supper, or families can meet together. The idea of having a bookstore kind of tied into that. When I said bookstore first hour, a couple of people were like, oh, eyes like, listen, it's not books a million, it's more like books 100 that I'm talking about. Something sort of small, right? This is, just key things, some Christian resources, some leadership resources, a few maybe, but just something small. But it's the idea, it's not about books, it's about community. We're creating places that build community in this place for those outside of our church. So we want something that advances our mission, that builds community. A third thing we want to do is we want to serve the city. A question that we've asked consistently, and we want to ask you to ask consistently as we go through this, figuring out what this is going to look like, is what does Spring Hill need, and how can we meet that need? And it's a very different question than often churches ask, sadly. I think far too often churches will approach schools or approach the city like what we want from you versus what can we give to you. And we're taking a very different approach on that. One of the things we've identified, and there's lots of other ideas, but one of the things we've identified that's a big need in Spring Hill is a preschool. Every preschool that I'm aware of, the classes are all full, the waiting lists are all full, and they often will cut off. One preschool we talked to, within like 2 weeks of opening the doors for the next semester, and this is like 6 months early, all of their classes were full, all the waiting lists had 10 or more people on them, and they cut the waiting list off at 10 because they're like, we're not going to fill 10 people off the waiting list. And so people are driving to Franklin or driving somewhere else to find a preschool that meets their needs of their kids. We want to create that. The idea that you could put, first of all, we're going to have children's ministry space anyway. We're going to build 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square feet of children's ministry space for all the kids we have on Sundays. So the idea that then through the week, instead of just locking the doors on that, we can have children in there whose parents are paying us to raise them in loving ways and teach them about not only crayons and numbers and letters, but also teach them about Jesus. It's a win-win-win. And because we're not trying to make a profit like preschools would normally have to do, we can give scholarships to single moms, or we can help those who are struggling to get into a good preschool. I mean, there's just so many levels of win here. And it's space that we're going to build anyway. It just requires us not to let it sit empty 6 days a week. And one of the things we've talked about along with this, the Anon Creek runs along the side of our property, along the west edge of our property. Interesting trivia, if you've not heard me say this before, if you look in John 3, it says John the Baptist was baptizing it near Anon because there's plenty of water. And then we happened to buy a church property with Anon Creek. Had no idea when we bought it. Anyway, so on the property, along the west edge, we own some property. Chapman's Crossing has approached us about donating some property along the west edge of the creek. We've actually been in conversation with Dakota Point. They're open, at least, to the idea of doing that as well. So we're going to have a large strip of property then along the west edge of the creek that's mostly floodplain, can't do much with it. So we approached the city and said, could we put a walk path there that would go from Duplex Road then all the way up to Wades Grove, challenge Chapman's Retreat to continue it south all the way to the school, challenge Wades Grove to continue it north all the way to Summit High School, and then you'd have a walking pedestrian pathway from Chapman's Retreat School all the way to Summit High School. And the Parks and Rec director almost got giddy when we started describing this to him. I don't know a lot of Parks and Rec directors, but they don't strike me as the giddy type. And he was just all excited about this. And he said, because that's school to school, there's federal grants I can apply for. We can probably pay for it with the federal grant. And the city would keep up the upkeep through the Parks and Rec department if you just give us the access to the space. And because all of a sudden now we'd have connections to hundreds of homes along that property within a short walk, we could build a bridge off of that facility to this community building that families could go for a walk and stop off and get a cup of coffee, or families could go for a walk and let their kids play on the outdoor playground, or they could get whatever. All kinds of opportunities to be in the community. For far too long, the church has sat back and said, why don't you come to us and then we'll do something with you? Instead of saying, let's find out the flow of life that you're already living. We'll get in the middle of that and put Jesus in the middle of your day. We'll build a place that you can trust, and we'll be a group of people you can trust. So when you have needs and concerns, you can come to us for help because you already feel like you know us. The last thing, this is probably the hardest to understand, is we want to build a building that's self-sustaining. We do not want to create a building that changes so we have to have huge financial obligations and we're drowning in debt. No, that's not what we're looking for. So what we want to do is we want to create a model that says all of these things will be paying a little bit of rent back to the church. Now, we're going to run the preschool, but if we went and started a new preschool completely on its own and rented space, we would have to pay for the teachers, we'd have to pay for the curriculum and the animal crackers and all that stuff, but we'd also have to pay rent, and we'd also be wanting to make a profit. Well, we don't want to make a profit. We don't have any interest. We're not trying to make money as a church. But if we can pay rent to ourselves, then all of a sudden the church has so much less obligation financially. If we were building a coffee shop, Starbucks would want to make a profit, or it's not worth it. We don't need to make a profit. If we can just pay ourselves rent off that space that we're going to use anyway, then it will help make the building so much more sustainable. Now, this won't happen immediately, so we're going to have some cash flow issues. We're going to have to raise some money and all of that. But long term, we really believe that we can build a facility that's not going to cost us more to live in than what we're spending on things now. Now, to give you an idea, I'm a pastor. I'm not a business guy. So we've got a team of business guys who are overseeing a lot of this, because this is not my deal. I have some ideas, but it's not my deal. So they're figuring all of that out. And we've got a building team figuring all that out. There's some really smart guys. I'm going to introduce a whole stage full of people to you next week who are already beginning to work on some of this. But it's the idea that we can do this in a way that's self-sustaining, that does not require us to financially overhaul how we do things. We can't do any ministry. We can't help anybody out. We can't give any money away because now we're just so tight financially. It's not what we're looking for. And there's ways we can do that. So what do we need from you? I want to ask you to help us with a couple of things. Is this still on? Okay, I felt like I was losing. Okay, a couple of things I want to ask you to help me with. First of all, and this really is the first thing, I want to ask that you would pray with us. We feel led by God to put down roots in our city. And to do that, we need to be asking God for His favor. Several times along this process, as we've been kind of ramping things up, we've just felt the favor of God, that doors have opened that we weren't expecting or whatever. We need more of that. If this is us trying to figure something out, we're limited. But if God is actually behind this, so we're going to be doing lots of things to build prayer into this process. There's a 24 hours of prayer coming up. We're going to do several prayer evenings and emphasis around this, because we really do believe that God honoring this, God providing for this, is the key for us to get this done. So I want to challenge you to begin to pray for this every day. If you keep a list or however you do it, just add this, pray for God's guidance and provision every day. Second thing I want to ask you to do is to volunteer some of your time. We've already got lots of people involved, and we're going to introduce a whole stage full of people next week, but we're going to need lots more. So if you have insight into how to do landscaping or how to do decoration or how to do we're going to need all those kind of things. We're going to have to build playgrounds, and there's all kinds of stuff we're going to do. We're figuring a lot of it out now, but we've got a lot more to figure out. I told first hour, I've really been debating this last several weeks, knowing this was coming, to be able to present to you two sort of contradictory ideas. The one idea is there's some really smart people who've been putting a lot of time into this, and so it's going to be well led. You can have confidence and assurance in that. But at the same time, everything's not been figured out yet. So you still have opportunity to weigh in. We still want your opinion. We still want your ideas. We still need your help. And so I've tried to figure out how to balance those two. So if you get both of those messages, then that's exactly what I wanted to convey to you. Because we need your help. There's a lot more to figure out. But there's some really smart men and women who have been putting a lot of time into this that are really going to help us out. So that's where we're going. But if you have insights into preschool, coffee shops, any kind of building design, we need your help on all those kind of things. Third thing I want to ask you to do is to give sacrificially. Now, we've never been a church that focuses on money. We weren't a church that focused on money yesterday. We're not going to be a church that focuses on money tomorrow. We're about people. We're about focusing on God. But we're adults here at the same time. And I'd be talking down to you if I acted like there wasn't some financial issues here. We're going to need to figure out how to pull together. I don't know we don't have Bill Gates attending this church. So it's not like we have 2 or 3 people who are going to write some enormous checks and that's going to take care of it. It's going to be all of us, just regular people, pulling together and giving what we can as God leads and God inspires, God provides to do that. So we're not going to talk about money all the time. We're not going to hijack every service to make it about money, but money is obviously a factor because we don't want to do this in a way that makes us drowning in debt. We don't want to do this in a way that makes us constantly worried about money and cutting things back. We're not about buildings, and we don't want to change that, and all of us pulling together is the way to fix that. Fourth thing I want you to help me with is I want to ask now that you would acknowledge ahead of time that this building is not going to be everything that you want it to be. It's not going to be everything that I want it to be. If you've ever built a house, especially if you bought one, but especially if you've built one where you've had some time to design and things, isn't there a point where you come out on the other side, maybe 2 months down the road, 6 months down the road, and you go, why did we do that? I mean, why didn't we make that closet a little bit wider? Why did we pick that color of carpet? Why did we do that fixture that way? Anybody had those kind of moments like that? Just me. All right, fantastic. I'm the only dunce in the room. That's good. Appreciate your support. Anyway, if you've ever done that, we're going to build a building 10 to 15 times bigger than your house. So if you normally have 2 to 3 of those things, if we have 20 or 30, we're about even with you. There's going to be a lot of things that just maybe snuck up on us or we didn't see coming or things that didn't work the way that we wanted to. In addition to that, if you're building a house, there's 1 or 2 of you making all the decisions. In this case, we're going to have lots of people making decisions. So there may be things that you go, what in the world was that about? And someone else loves that. I mean, this is like their favorite part of the whole building, but it's not what you would do. And that's okay because the church is not about any one of us. There will be lots of things in this building that are not the way I would design them, but that's the way that we design them. And we are much better than me. We are much better than any of us. And there may be some things that we just choose not to do because we're not a church that spends crazy money on hype and such. So there may be some wonderful ideas that we choose not to do because we just don't want to put that much money towards those things. I think I've told you this before, but I remember when Amy and I built our house several years ago, and we were sitting down with the real estate agent to talk about the different options. And if you've ever had that experience, you know that's where they give you all these ideas, and you need this, you love this, and if you say no, oh, that's stupid, I wouldn't do it either. I mean, you've had those experiences where whatever you say is exactly the right answer. So he's sitting down with us, and he's like, you know what you guys want? Because our lot is very small on the front, and it widens out so it's bigger in the back. He said, your backyard's great. That's a big sales pitch for your backyard. So what you want, he said, you're going to have the afternoon sun pointing on your backyard. You ought to put this awning that we add, and it'll provide shade on that back porch, and that'd be awesome. I said, that sounds really good. I've seen some of those in the neighborhood. That's great. I said, how much does that cost? I mean, it'd be great. Then we put the siding up the posts. There's 2 posts, and it ties into the thing, and the roof, and all this. It'd be great. I said, that sounds great. How much does that cost? He said, we even put ceiling fans in the middle there. And so you can turn that on when it gets hot, it moves the air around, it keeps them getting stuffy. I said, that's great, how much does it cost? I mean, you're gonna really love it, it's gonna add the resale value. I said, I'm not trying to sell my house, I'm trying to buy the thing. How much does this cost? You had me at hello, give me what's the number? And he said, it's $10,000. So if you go over to my house later, in the summer, you'll roast in the backyard with the rest of it. Because I didn't put the $10,000 awning. As wonderful as that was, he had me. He had the palm of his hand. But I want to spend $10,000 on that awning. As great as that might be. So this building is going to be a deal where there's going to be lots of wonderful ideas that just get cut out of the budget. We're not going to do all of those wonderful ideas. That doesn't mean they're not great. It just means we're not going to spend $1 bazillion getting this thing pulled off. Now, this may not be, I would say in this room, there's a wide variety of responses to this. Some of you are sort of overwhelmed, kind of giving me the deer in the headlights. Some of you are sort of skeptical. You've been through this kind of thing before. Others of you are very excited, like now we're finally at church. I don't really agree with that, but now we're finally at church. It's going to be great. All the different responses you might have. It's pretty exciting to me. I'm probably all of those things a little bit, but it's pretty exciting to me. But my prayer is that it doesn't change who we are. We're not building this building so that we can become a church. God's already done that. We're not building this building so we can be a real church or we can really be effective. No, this is just a tool. It's the next step we feel like we're led to by God, but our focus is not changing off who we are or who we've been or what we're about. And so I want you to help me with that. Years from now, we're going to, 20, 25 years from now, some of you will still be part of this church. And you'll be a lot more experienced, but some of you will still be part of this church. And you'll look back and you'll talk about the early days of WellSpring when we met in a school, and you'll know what that means. And a lot of people you're talking to may not know what that means, but you'll know what that means because you're part of this initial core group. And what I want you to help me with is that 20, 25 years from now, whoever of us is still around in this church, that we're still the church that God called us to. We're still a church that's real. We're still a church that's focused on people and relationships. We're still a church that serves and that meets the needs of those outside of our church. We're still a church that reaches people far from God and helps them come in and find faith. And the building doesn't change that. The building just gives us more abilities to do that. The building gives us an opportunity to get into the flow of life that people are already in and meet them where they are. So I want you to help me with that. Everything that we do is to bring glory and praise to God, not only from ourselves, but from more and more people outside of this room. And that's a goal worthy of fighting for. So I want you to help me out with that. Okay? Let's bow your heads and let's pray together.